Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I'm here once again with Aidan Etkin. Thanks for being here again, Aidan.
Yeah, of course.
So we are now doing the second part of our long lecture on Ks. This one will be a more of a deep dive into the kind of K framework that we started introducing last time, which is a lot about how, we're kind of treating Ks almost, you can think about it like a theory argument where we're saying, you should drop the team for an abuse if they're using justifications or assumptions in their arguments that might have something like racism or other kinds of justifications of violence, then that should be itself a reason to drop them. So today we are going to start with a lot of the responses that we got to this little thought experiment form we put in the description of the last video, which was asking people to think from the perspective of a K team if they're making an argument against another team that has like maybe some racist assumptions about immigrants inside some of their arguments that are very securitizing. The other team just sort of apologizes and they're like, you shouldn't vote us down for this. You should just, vote down the argument maybe, but not the team. We didn't know that we didn't really understand that these assumptions were racist per se. It was an honest mistake. We won't do it again. And we asked teams what they would respond to that with. And we got a lot of different answers, but a lot of them had some very similar themes. So we're going to tease out some of those themes, get some good feedback on them, and then explain some answers that might even be slightly better to this kind of apology that teams might make. So I guess without further ado, the number one biggest response, probably for a reason, was a very similar argument to what we hear in theory, which was that you shouldn't drop the argument, you should drop the debater because it is the best way to set norms. It's the best way to create incentives on kind of both sides. Like intuitively, it's the best way to create deterrent incentives. So you stop them from going and winning off of this racist argument in the future, for example. If you don't drop them with the ballot on the line, then they'll have an incentive, maybe because of just laziness, they don't want to write another argument, or because they've won on it in the past, to just continue using this argument, which is bad for debate. And also incentives on the other side. Like maybe it is good to create a type of debate where you like it is possible to win the ballot by calling someone else out for their racism. Because otherwise, like we will never do it because it's always a time trade-off with things that could access the ballot. And so it's maybe a better form of debate to give us the possibility of winning the ballot off of doing this. So first of all, what do you think about this argument, Aidan? And how would you maybe change it or improve it or word it differently?
Yeah, I definitely think this is probably the best response to the thought experiment that we gave in the last video. So just to break it down into both layers, the first part of the argument is actively voting people down for doing racist things as necessary to deter them from doing that in the future. And the analysis you can do is pretty simple. If you allow them to get away with the racist argument being dropped, then that sends a signal that racism is okay as long as, it's not like the only thing you do. If you have another contention or another two contentions to default back to, it's no harm, no foul. But obviously, voting the team down for any instance of racism kind of really makes them averse to it, which is obviously good because minimizing racism is obviously good. And then the second part of the argument is just in terms of like essentially the skew that drop the argument creates for the other side. And what Max says makes a lot of sense, which is that if you vote the other team down, that gives an active incentive to call out racism because you know that, it can be the central part of the round and that it's like an independent win condition, which is good. But I think the way that you can kind of go a little further with this is just to say this creates like irreversible skew because the 1AC has invested some time into reading this racist contention. We've invested even more time calling it out. We've read studies to disprove it. We've problematized their rhetoric. We've introduced a framework argument, and letting them drop the argument in the face of that, kind of obviates all of that time, which is bad, right? And the extreme argument you can make is that if it is true that debaters are primarily competitively incentivized and they will do anything and everything to maximize their chance of winning, then if you could read, a one card advantage in the 1AC, that's just like racism straight down, the negative would obviously strategically spend 4 minutes being like, what the hell, man? Why would you say any of that? You can get up, spend 30 seconds on drop the argument. I'm really sorry about this. And there's this like massive time trade-off, and the debate is now super easy for you to win, right? And the only way to solve that, or reverse quote unquote the irreversible skew, is to vote in the other direction, which necessitates drop the debater.
That makes sense. So I think we can maybe even break down this first part into two like subparts too.
Hmm.
The first, like the way that you're phrasing this is really interesting to me. Maybe there's like a non-consequential version of this. Like it is ethically wrong to affirm racism or to send a signal that racism is good in some way or is okay or like permissible and should not is able to get off scot-free. And then the other argument is that the consequential version of that, which is just like the
Hmm.
signal does something, right? Like people interpret this in a certain way, and this causes more arguments to proliferate that have these kinds of violent assumptions, which are probably bad for us if we're able to prove something later on, like how this actually shapes the way that we think of the real world, for example, which is an argument we'll talk about later. So I think that's interesting. Probably intuitively, most people will take the side of like the consequential version of this argument,
Hmm.
but I wonder how it would look to have like a non-consequential, just like you have an ethical obligation to not like allow this to go unpunished or something like that.
So I have some thoughts on that. I think that there's a middle ground in the sense that there is a version of this argument which is basically like what's called second order consequentialism. It says that something is always bad because on aggregate it has like negative consequences. So it's like a deontological and consequential claim. And the argument I'm referring to here is a golden rule, which a lot of people might have heard about, and if not, we can talk about it. But in terms of like the purely deontological side of things, vote against it because it's bad. I think there's two issues for it, right? I think that there's like a logical argument to be made about consequentialism being good when it comes to solvency, because what this would justify is an app team getting up and saying, listen, I know my plan does nothing, but we read an impact about climate change, and climate change is like super bad. And if we can't solve for it and voting app does nothing, on principle, you should reject climate change because it's so bad, right? And I feel like we would laugh an app out of the room, if they tried getting away with that. And we should apply that same logical standard to this argument that's like, even if your ballot does nothing, you should vote against racism just cause. I think the second problem is voting for racism is not the same as being racist or sending a signal that racism is acceptable, because that's not what the ballot does. The ballot is not a referendum on whether or not debaters said true arguments, not a referendum on whether debaters said ethical arguments, said the right or wrong things. All it is a sign is of who did the better technical debating, right? The losses specifically, they are a signal of technical failures, not ethical failures, which probably, is like pretty apt defense to this claim that voting for something racist is racist, and voting against something racist is anti-racist.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Could you explain just in like a minute what is the
Mm-hmm.
golden rule argument?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, it's what you were talking about. The argument is that the judge should unconditionally reject racism. And I think the better way of phrasing it is that this mandate that the ballot be able to solve for racism is bad because it creates two burdens for the judge. The first burden it creates is that the judge needs to have the power to step in and stop what debaters do in the future. The second burden it creates is that the judge must have the power to turn back time to before the racist act occurred, right? And these are kind of the conditions that policy teams set when they say ballot solvency, right? They're like, your ballot can't turn back time, it can't deter abuse in the future, so it cannot solve, right? So the golden rule says the idea that you need to do either of these things in the face of racism is ridiculous because essentially it ethically blackmails you into just sitting and being a bystander while racism occurs. And that inaction, right, sends a signal to students that there's no recourse for racism in this activity that's called debate. And that, causes them to feel exhausted and left out. And, they're mad because they don't experience vindication, right? So the simplest way of putting it is that if we accept ballot solvency as this, kind of paradigmatic thing that judges ought to follow, we spend the next 4 years of our debate careers hearing this whenever we hit racists. Well, the affirmative was racist, but, right? Pretty exhausting. But if you, instead of following the mandate of ballot solvency, choose instead to, quote, unconditionally reject racialized practices, that reverse causally solves because that signal is never sent in the first place. You never show debaters that racism is a no-cost option, so debaters never feel exhausted, which solves. So in this case, the premise is deontic, that you should never vote for racism, but the logic is consequentialist insofar as it shows that never voting against racism breeds exhaustion, and reverse causally, voting against racism stops that exhaustion from happening in the first place. So that's
That's
like the TLDR of
interesting.
the golden
Yeah.
rule.
I feel like I have two thoughts on this. One is it
Mm-hmm.
seems like it's still almost at its core is about solvency argument, just like solving something different, like maybe a
Yeah, it
ballot
is.
policy for like exhaustion, for instance.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah.
The second thing that I want to unpack a little bit before we move
Hmm.
on, I think that there's an interesting interaction this has with like the ethical system of rule util. So rule util,
Hmm.
for people who don't know, is like the premise is essentially it's really hard to be a pure utilitarian, an act utilitarian, we call it, and go around in your day-to-day life like doing everything in the way that maximizes utility. That's really difficult. We don't know what maximizes utility in all cases. And so instead, it might be preferable for us to follow certain rules, like don't kill people, right? Even if in certain cases killing people might increase utility, in general, and because we're pretty bad estimators of what those cases are, it's better to stick to the rule. Like if everyone stuck to the rule of not killing people, the world would certainly be consequentially better. And so rule util is like a way to fill in this problematic gap in act utilitarianism of uncertainty and like maybe sometimes having cognitive biases that cause us to incorrectly estimate what will create positive utility. And I feel like you can apply that logic to this golden rule argument a little bit. It's like maybe in this case, we can't prove that the ballot will actually solve racism. You probably can't prove that it won't either. Like we don't really know,
Hmm.
but we do know that like this is such a bad thing that it probably would be a good rule to generally always act against it. Like it is a good rule to follow to act against racism, even if we shouldn't have the burden of proving with any certainty that in this case that will be a good thing, but it is generally a good rule to follow because on aggregate, like if everyone did always act against racism, the world would certainly be a better place.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree. I think that's kind of like the logic behind that argument because the way that it evolved is the original golden rule is very different. And, this is kind of like something we got away with a lot last year where people had answers to the original golden rule because they answered the argument by name, but our warrant for it was different. And we kind of just like got up and we're like, well, you answered the wrong argument. Too bad, so sad. And the answer that they read usually was just like deontology is bad, right? Like golden rule is deontological. And our response always was just like it's consequential, right? So kind of like in the creation of the argument, knowing that what we had to respond to is like deontology is bad, consequentialism is good, we kind of like made it fit that mold a little bit. So it kind of turned out with this deontological premise, but this consequential like logic to it.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how these arguments evolve over time. I feel like a
Yeah.
lot of this, like if there's one lesson to take from this, it's just like don't answer arguments by name, answer the
Yeah.
actual warrant, and then you
Yeah,
will
yeah, yeah,
never have
yeah.
this problem. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
and I
Yeah.
really want to like echo that because this is something that I actually told my debaters basically verbatim. It's like when you ask cross-ex questions, ask about warrants, don't ask about claims. When you refer to arguments and answer them, answer the logic, don't answer the claim, so on and so forth, right? And it's not going to only make your debating a lot better. It's also going to make it a lot easier for you to judge because I have no idea what like claims you're referring to when you're reading straight down your blocks. In fact, they might be the wrong blocks or they might not be contextual. But if you just like, listen to what your opponent has said, boil down the argument to its abstract logic and critique that logic, then it's super easy to follow and that will increase, your chances of winning like exponentially. It's super
Yeah,
important.
absolutely. It's just better debate. Like,
Yeah.
I swear to God, one of my biggest gripes about debate in general is this trend toward like treating arguments as their name instead of as the actual logic within them.
Hmm.
I feel like that's quite bad for everything I like about debate.
Yeah,
Uh,
I agree. I mean, like I've seen like my students like give speeches just like using a lot of my blocks. And I was like, okay, I literally wrote these speeches and I have no idea what the hell's going on based on the round I'm watching, which is like a really bad sign, like really bad. Like
yeah.
people have to realize that like the way that people debate now is they have a file with blocks and they copy and paste their flow into their blocks. That's absolutely incorrect. Instead, you should have a flow and you copy and paste your blocks into your flow and you modulate them so you actually like debate your opponent instead of giving like what is essentially a glorified speaking drill, right? Because if you're just not responding to your opponent's arguments and you're just tildeing like random blocks without contextualizing them, like you're literally not debating them. You're just talking. Like it's like the worst thing ever.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like this is especially prevalent in K debate because a lot of people have like a lack of understanding about arguments, and so they solely rely on the name.
Yeah.
And then unfortunately, like I feel like judges get reputationally blackmailed maybe into like voting on arguments that no one in the room has actually understood, just because they have heard that they're a name that, maybe it's technically dropped or whatever. I
Hmm.
think it's quite bad. But yeah, I think in general, a good way to respond to Ks is by actually investigating the logic behind the arguments they're making, especially in K framework, instead of just like honestly, like forget about golden rule. Who cares? Just focus on what argument are they actually making.
Hmm.
Okay, cool. So with that, the second main response I heard that actually you also talked about already a little bit,
Hmm.
is this idea that there's like a skew in the round that might be created by drop the argument. That like maybe, for instance, as you said, like they could read a one card advantage, and then we would spend 4 minutes on calling it racist, and then that would create like a time skew. I'm a little bit skeptical of this argument. It seems like the same logic would apply to a defense on arguments as well. And it seems like the solution is just that you should spend the same amount of time as they spent reading the racist argument, calling it out for being racist. I'm not entirely sure why that would be
I
like
Just to
worse.
clarify, I think the difference is when it comes to the defensive argument, it's never a win condition for the other team, so the skew isn't as bad, right? Like the reason why skew is bad is because a team introduces an argument that they can win the debate on, right? That argument is then answered, or you're saying like defense from the other side, right?
Yeah, I also think that begs the question, right? Like our argument is that you can't win off of this.
Well, I would clarify and say the argument is not that you can't win off of it, it's rather that you like actively should lose for it, which is like, all the drop the debater stuff. But I think that the argument that just like spend as much time answering the argument as was originally invested in the argument is a little bit hard to kind of like quantify because well one you have like the intuitive argument which is like I'm not timing your speech and saying like okay you spent 30 seconds doing racism I'll answer racism for 30 seconds. The second thing is that like it actively encourages debaters to spend less time calling out racism and like limits the amount of arguments they can make as to why racism is bad, which is problematic because like one it's probably good to like have racism be a larger focal point of the debate, and two, it allows debates where potentially the negative did not spend enough time calling out racism, and now teams can get away with it. Comparatively, if they were able to um, like have this unequal time allocation. And I think a perfect example of this, just to like make this a lot more concrete, imagine someone said a slur and it took them 2 seconds, right? Your logic would say, in order to avoid skew, just explain why slurs are bad in 2 seconds. You literally cannot do that, right? It probably requires more than 2 seconds. And with that being said, it literally now, under that paradigm, is impossible for you to critique slurs. So this argument that's like, oh, just like match their time, I don't think is too persuasive. I think the argument that's like it's non-unique because of defense and the like is probably a little bit more persuasive. And I think that just to clarify, in regular theory debates, the reason why skew is different is because usually the impact of skew is this fairness argument, and fairness is like irreversible. So you are already unfair. Dropping the unfair argument does not restore the skew that was imposed upon us. So the only recourse is you losing. But insofar as like the quote unquote skew created by you dropping a racist contention doesn't really impact out to fairness, I don't think that same logic would apply here. So I think that TLDR, the negative can say these two arguments, right? Negative can say, here's two reasons to drop the debater, and here's like a skew standard. And the affirmative, if it gets up and kind of makes this argument that's like skews inevitable, um, blah 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 blah. Strategically speaking, it's just smarter to go for the first two arguments because I think they're a lot better.
Interesting. I think this might all boil down to the argument about incentives to talk more about racism in
Hmm.
debate.
Hmm.
I think
Hmm.
like everything else, I think is kind of the same. And I'm not sure I really buy it, which is like you created the skew yourself by spending more time than you needed to on this argument. I'm also not sure that the slur example is great. I actually have heard a lot of rounds, not with slurs in them, but where
Hmm.
there's like, maybe a bad analogy about slavery or something. And the response from the other team is like, also like this analogy is whack. Like, don't vote on this. It's clearly like like
Well,
like a
that's not an
false
argument.
comparison. Well, I don't know. I think it is. as much as the argument they're making is. The point I'm making though is I think that like reasonably it is possible to spend a similar amount of time on an argument as they spend on it. But the important thing is like your answer to this is compelling, which is that the difference is that this doesn't incentivize you then to focus on the question of racism. You only spend as much
Yeah,
time
yeah.
as they spend, or roughly the same amount, which means if they haven't spent very much time on racism, yet their racism is quite egregious,
Yeah,
you
like you shouldn't
yeah,
be artificially constrained in your ability to call out racism.
right. Well, I mean, I guess my argument wouldn't be an artificial constraint. My argument is just like um the argument you made is that if you drop the argument, it would skew us. The argument I'm making is that it is not a skew against you that we created, and it would be competitively
Okay, if you
viable.
spent the same amount of time.
Yes.
Yeah, and the response
If
to
you
that
made
is
a drop
like
the argument
it,
argument.
it puts racism on the back burner.
Yes, exactly. So it all comes down
Yeah.
to that, right?
But I
So
think that the corollary should also be like I think it's like two prongs, right? Like first you put racism on the back burner and you prevent it from being the focal point of the debate. But second, it's also bad because, your argument is that like, oh, just like spend less time explaining why racism is bad, bro, because we didn't spend a lot of time being racist.
I guess I disagree with that one. I think that they're the same argument at its core because if you don't make the
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
argument,
yeah, yeah.
like
I agree.
like
I think
this
it's
would
just like a
apply
little
to
bit of
defense
nuance.
as well. It's like, for example, if I read a one card advantage, you
Hmm.
should still disprove my one card advantage, and it is in your interest to spend less around the same amount of time disproving my one card advantage.
Well, I think there's a difference in the pedagogical value of disproving an advantage and the pedagogical value of like
Right,
problematizing
exactly,
racism.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We totally agree.
Okay, yeah, 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 yeah.
That just means that I think in truth, when it's debated out, these two prongs become the same.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Like by the yeah.
Right. And then so then the major question in the round is still like, is it better to have a model of debate in which you can be incentivized by the ballot to spend a larger amount of time calling out racism? And that's kind of the previous response.
I
Okay.
agree.
Yeah.
Now that I think about it, just like going back to the original prompt, which was just to clarify, team says something racist, then says drop the argument, and the kind of like caveat is they also say like apology solve. I spent some time like last year thinking about this apologies argument, and I remember like I like having some like different like persuasive stuff against it. It's just like not coming to my head. I mean, the first thing you can do is like you can independently critique like the logic of apologies. And this happened in like an NDT debate between Kansas and Emory, where I think like, Emory said something and then proceeded to apologize. And Kansas is like, fuck you, apologizing is bad. Um, I think it was Kansas. I'm like 99% sure it was Kansas. It was, yeah. So, that's an argument you can make. But there was some other like more like analytical responses. I'm just trying to like jog my memory to them.
Yeah. The apologies thing is kind of weird because I do think I'm not sure how separate it is from the original just drop the debater argument. Like it seems like at best the apology is like a warrant for drop the debater, but like what does it
Yes,
do?
yes.
It like maybe like the attempt is to reduce some of the potential for offense from drop the debater.
I
Um,
mean, you can make the argument that's like punishing someone post apology is bad, but that's just like it's just so stupid. Like persuasively and technically, I don't think it makes much sense.
sure, yeah, maybe. I mean, I think we can dig into that later as well.
Hmm.
Um, okay, so the next response, if you're ready for it,
Yeah.
is uh, let's see. Whether or not you intended the abuse is unverifiable. I think in this case, in the thought experiment, like the team that had this read against them also was like, we didn't know. And I think there's also like an argument that people were making in the responses to the prompt that said like ignorance is not an excuse and like you should have done your research and stuff. What do you think of this response?
Well, I mean, it's just zero. Like we didn't know. Okay. Like okay. And if anything, it like proves our argument about why dropping the debater is key because this is how you find out, right? Like the way you find out that you can't say stuff like this isn't like looking at a wiki or tab room and seeing that a team this was the one EC and then they actually managed to end up winning and the debate became about something else and you're like oh maybe it's not too bad looks like they recovered they clutched right versus like you see the comparative L on tab room 2NR is racism bad, and you're like, oh damn, I guess that's racist. I should never say it, right? So at best, this argument is like a nothing burger, and at worst, it proves why drop the debater is key. And this is like a similar analog for disclosure debates, actually, where a team that, has a either isn't very well versed with the national circuit or their school is relatively new, hits another team. The other team is like, well, you should disclose. You have nothing on your wiki. The original team says, I didn't know. No one told me I had to disclose. The logical response to that is like, hello, this is what norm setting is. This is how you find out you need to disclose, right? The way that no one ever finds out they need to disclose is that no one ever loses for not disclosing or has theory read on them for not disclosing, right? So this, essentially like is a uniqueness claim, quote unquote, for the theory shell.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess one way to think about this is like the original argument, like we didn't know. I think it only applies to like the deontic version of the golden rule argument. Like if the argument against this team is like you made egregiously racist assumptions and you
Hmm.
committed like a terrible intentional crime for which you
Hmm.
need to be punished. Then I think maybe it is a little bit more persuasive to be like, this is not a terrible, egregious crime. We like did not know that this was at all like this, and we didn't intend it at all. Intentions seem to only matter though in the deontic version. So if we're going for any of this like rule util or like consequentialist stuff with ballot solvency, I think then this response just, I agree with you, is
Yeah.
and it just doesn't really apply to this debate.
Hmm.
Okay,
That makes
cool.
sense. Yeah.
Which also means I don't even think you need to answer it from the K side if they don't apply it. This like it just doesn't seem to like. I guess you could spend a minute, like a tiny bit on it, but like you shouldn't. Don't spend too much time on this argument because it. I don't think it really applies if you're going for any consequential arguments. Um,
Yeah, I think just like
yeah,
from a strategic perspective, this is like the type of thing you expand upon in cross-X and use to make them look really bad. So what I would do personally, I'd be like start of cross-X. You didn't know that racism was bad. What's the argument? Like, please talk. Like, go. Like, like you basically give them an opportunity to dig themselves a hole, right? Because a team that like from the get-go thought that this was a response that needed to be made. Certainly, if you give them even more time to make more responses, will not kind of really make themselves look better, if that makes
right.
sense.
Yeah. The rest of the responses, I guess we can like throw them together because I think they all perform weird like side functions that aren't necessarily directly
Hmm.
responsive. So one of the big ones is like fiat is illusory. To me, I mean, you could talk on this too, but to me, this just seems like it begs the question of whether or not you do get to drop the debater in the first place. Like, it doesn't seem to matter if fiat is illusory if this is still a drop the argument issue because like okay, who cares? Like, there's no pre-fiat offense.
Yeah, I think that essentially the thought process behind the people who gave that answer is like they thought it was like a framework debate, in which
Right.
case, like Fiat's illusory maybe makes sense if the other team tried to say, listen, even though we said something racist in here, our plan saves people out there. The response to that is like, voting F doesn't do that. Voting X solves racism in
Right, right,
debate.
right, right.
But insofar as that like is not an argumentative chain that started, it's kind of like a non sequitur here.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting. Also, I guess we should explain a little bit. Fiat is illusory for anyone who
Mhm.
doesn't know, is this weird term that has been created. I honestly don't know where it comes from. Like, why are we using the word illusory? Like, the argument is just the idea that like voting pro or voting affirmative will actually do something is clearly false. Like, this is a made up game. We're pretending. And so, like, that implies that anything that we're doing here that has a real impact that the ballot can affect is a little bit more tangible than these like fake impacts, which only matter insofar as they, I don't know, affect our education or something along those lines. And so if they're not making an argument that this positively affects your education or whatnot, then this should categorically be a higher concern in your ballot.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that like the best use case for this argument is whenever an affirmative gets up and tries to answer link arguments by saying case is a good idea, the consequences of the plan are, extremely beneficial. The way the negative needs to push back on that is be like, listen, the thesis of framework is that you can't weigh case against the K. This debate is not about whether the 1EC is a good idea in the real world, but rather whether the performance of the 1EC in this round was good or bad. And the implication of fiat being illusory is that every reason why quote unquote the case is a good idea or the plan is a good idea does not function as offense under your interpretation because voting affirmative won't actually, materialize the impacts that they solve or materialize solvency for their impacts. But voting affirmative will kind of like, normalize or spread these problematic assumptions, justifications, logics that you have critiqued, right?
right, that makes sense. Okay, the next response that we have here is this argument that says this is severance. So in debate terms, severance means when you say like, oh, I made this argument, but then later on you're like, oh, actually, I'm gonna like take that away. I don't want that argument anymore. You can drop it off the flow. Um, I don't I don't actually think this is severance because I think inherent to the K is a bit of what actually is defense. Like the argument that the K is making is that this argument is racist and false because of its racist assumptions, right? Um, like the racist logic is incorrect, is something that seems inherently assumed by the K team. And so that also means that like I don't think this is severance. Like you can agree if you're agreeing that the racist logic is incorrect, you're not severing out of anything and you're not like I don't know, like you're not like I don't know why you're bound to like the words that you said before. Like I don't know why I have to stick to something. So for example, if we're doing this in a normal topical debate and you say my first contention is wrong because of this defense, I can be like, "Oh shoot, you're right. My first contention is wrong." I don't have to like stick to saying, "No, it's right. No, it's right. I'm correct." So I
Yeah,
just don't really think this applies.
so I agree with you in this context. I think this is another example of like people making K arguments in the wrong context. So I think that again, the quote unquote best use case for the severance argument is in the following scenario. The 1AC says something racist. The 1NC calls him out. The 2AC gets up and is like, we're kicking the advantage. Right? That's all they say. Not this drop the argument, not we're sorry, not we didn't know, just we're kicking the advantage. In that case, negative gets up and says, you can't sever out of your racist reps. Just because you kicked the advantage in the 2AC doesn't mean you didn't say racist things in the 1AC, so you should still be held accountable for that. So in that context, severance is like pretty straightforward. In this context, I don't really think it makes as much sense. And there's also a lot of arguments to be said. There's like a lot to be said in terms of like argument priority, which is like the AF gets up and is like, we didn't know racism is bad. If we did know, we shouldn't lose. And we're also sorry. Like if this is like, like the three quote unquote arguments being made in the 2AC, the last place your mind should wander is like, oh, you're severing from the 1AC. You should just be like, this is, 0, 0, 0. Like answer the arguments at their heart. A lot of this other stuff is kind of like auxiliary and doesn't let you get it's not like really high return on investment. Like setting severance bad um, is comparatively worse than spending that extra like, sentence on explaining why the ballot is key or why dropping them is key or why apologies don't solve so on and so forth.
Right, that makes sense. Okay. The next argument that people have is actually this one was not explained. This is another example of like things having a name and like not
Hmm.
logic behind it. I heard this, so I judged an LD tournament recently. I heard this quite a bit. This is the pathology DA. Can you
Yeah,
explain
yeah, yeah.
the pathology DA?
Oh, yeah, sure. So pathology decide is basically like you cannot wait case like rather actually here's explanation of it. If we win a link, this is the K team being we, moot case, anything else greenlights psychologically violent research as long as a plan is a good idea. It's impossible and exhausting for teams to prove that the consequences of the app's impacts out there outweigh the consequences of the app's rhetoric in here. Basically just like if they can weigh case against a K, extinction beats, everything because it outweighs any and every slur. The only recourse is that you can not let them weigh the case if a linked argument is won. So that's a
Right.
pathology they
So
said.
the way that this would play out in a debate is the K team says something like Fiat is illusory. Nothing happens out there when you cast the ballot. The other team says maybe so, but it still is more fair or better for education or something for you to pretend that it does so that we can compare our like post Fiat out there impacts of the topic to your impacts about racism in the K. And then the response to that is this, which is the pathology dissad, which is like, no, if you were able to do that, then you could just have as many racist justifications as you want. And then it would be impossible for us to compare all of those to like what would happen out there if you have some other random argument about extinction or something. And so we should focus instead on like the abuse that is actually happening instead of this like hypothetical benefit that you get from your other arguments.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, K-Debate used to have like a lot of disads on framework. So, if you watch rounds from a bit ago, teams would rattle off 3 or 4 reasons why framework was bad. The hallucinatory whiteness dissad, this K of Fiat and that K of Fiat. And really all of that did is establish the fact that they should not be able to leverage the case, right? And no matter how you do it, I think the pathology side is obviously the most efficient way to do it. You need to stop the 1AC from being able to weigh the case, because if you don't, they get the freest 2AR, which is just like, this is awkward. They did not read a disadd to our interpretation. They did not explain why we cannot weigh the case in the face of the K. Even if they get reps links, we get case. Extinction versus some problematic word that we said, which one do you think is more important, right? They win 10 out of 10 times. So you need some like way to stop them from giving that 2AR, right? It's like blocking a goal in soccer, right? You just can't let them get away with that. And the pathology decided it serves this function essentially.
Honestly, this does seem like an artifact of like different types of K debate though. Because right now in this style of K framework, we're really thinking about the K as if it's almost like a theory shell.
Hmm,
And I
hmm.
don't think this makes any sense from the perspective of the team debating the K to make an argument that's like we should be able to weigh our case against the theory shell. Like imagine if you said that against disclosure theory or something. You're like, well, it is more educational for us to have disclosed, but you conceded extinction, so GG, right? Like these are clearly just on different levels.
I mean, I think that if the affirmative team made an argument versus disclosure that was non-res theory, that's functionally the same as saying that we should be able to weigh the case against disclosure theory. But because I think the
Right.
argument is less that we should be able to weigh the case against disclosure theory, and more so that we should win for proving that the resolution is a good idea, which entails being able to weigh the case. Any other burden is regressive and thus unfair. It just
Well,
so happens that,
okay, honestly,
like,
that's not even weigh the case though. Like it's not like you could lose the weighing, right? Like your case could be like the affirmative helps one person by a tiny bit, and the disclosure
mhm.
theory could have a bigger impact than that, and you could concede that. But still, if you're winning non-resolutional theory bad, or you're winning like truth testing, like the only jurisdiction the judge has is to vote for which if the affirmative or the negative is correct on the resolution. Like I don't even think this is weighing between them. This is just deciding which layer the judge should vote on.
Well, it is. I think I disagree. I think it is weighing the case. It just so happens in the disclosure example, case does not outweigh. I think it's
But they
basically
would
just
still
like,
win. Like if the
well,
app
weighing the case does not mean you automatically win, right? It just means you get access to the impacts that the case solves, and you can leverage them against anything and
right,
everything that the
but
negative
well,
says.
that's what I'm saying, right? Is
Yeah.
that like in this hypothetical silly thought experiment where like
Hmm.
the app quote unquote gets to weigh their case against disclosure theory,
Yeah.
the case does not outweigh disclosure theory. Like
Yeah. So
the
they just
like,
lose. Yeah.
but I don't think they do. That's what I'm saying. It's like if they're running non-resolutional theory bad, it's sort of irrelevant if the
Oh,
impact.
okay. I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
It's like
Um,
not
yeah,
like
I agree, because I think that although the arguments are functionally the same, um, they're not like in practice the same, if that makes sense.
I kind
Um,
of think it's the opposite. It seems like in practice they're the same because the app would always outweigh, but functionally they're not because
yeah,
technically
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay,
they're
yeah, I
not. It's
see.
not a consideration of weighing at all.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think that makes sense. My intuition for why like this, occurs is because there's like realistically two justifications for planned focus. The first one is just like we should be able to weigh the case because anything else would moot an entire speech. And mooting an entire speech is bad because it irreversibly skews the debate. It also splits it into two layers where we both have to justify the consequences and rhetoric of the plan, and the negative can win for disproving either. So that's the weigh the case argument. And the second argument is just like planned focus proper says that links to anything that isn't the plan's causal consequences are unpredictable, that like allows negative to monopolize prep, which is thus unfair. So I think in the second case, this is really what non-res theory is getting at, just this predictability slash regress argument. So it doesn't entail weighing the case; it just entails not weighing anything that isn't the case, if that makes sense. So
Right,
like it
that makes
excludes
sense.
theory, not includes the plan. But the first argument, has that little caveat we've just explored.
Yeah.
Uh,
Which
Even
is
though in the context of framework, they both lead to the same conclusion.
it's really strange though that like I mean logically it seems like this should apply equally to K and theory, right? But for some reason people
Well,
only use it
it
against
it
K.
does. Like an argument that we used to say is that planned focus is bad because it bans theory arguments, which allows like infinite abuse, right? So in a paradigm of planned focus, the affirmative can do whatever and
Right.
literally anything that they want, right? They can read in the
Yeah.
context of LD, tricks, nibs, a priorities. There's no theoretical recourse for that in a world of planned focus,
Right.
so it's more unfair. I think the problem with that is like literally no one ever answered it. Like it was in the 1NC, like the third point, like super explicit. Every 1AR ever dropped it. We just never went for it because it was just doing too much. But I think the
That's
argument is like somewhat persuasive. And I think that in a lot of debates where it's like you think that fairness is kind of a pressing concern, it's like worth it to extend if it's not answered. I just think that in most rounds, there's just like a much simpler path to victory where it's just
Yeah,
doing too much to
absolutely.
extend
That
that.
makes sense. So we've gotten through all of the different responses that were in the form.
Hmm.
Now, either first of all, first, I guess, do you have any other responses that weren't in the form that we should talk about before we
I
move to
mean,
like the different layers of
yeah,
K-framework?
for sure. I mean, like I have one that's kind of similar to what was said, and I think it's like more intuitive than it is true, but it's essentially just like it's illogical to be able to get away with things for just saying you didn't mean to like make the argument, if that makes sense. So like let's say you double turn yourself, you read warming good and then also warming bad. The other team calls you out, you get up in your next speech and you're like, my bad, I apologize for reading warming bad, scratch the argument. Obviously you can't do that. It would be illogical because you're bound to what you say. But the implication would be that applying the same standard to this, um, it's also illogical to let them get away with that. But I think that what's it called? The real difference here is that the reason why what happened in the example with the double turn is bad is because they have basically conceded an argument they themselves have made without the introduction of defense from the other team, which is not true in this case because they have not like conceded defense. That they have conceded explicit defense. They've also conceded they were racist. They just say that it's not a lose condition. So I think it's different for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
it reminds me
yeah.
of the discussion we had about severance earlier.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, seems like they aren't admitting, like they aren't saying that their argument is true, and the other team is saying that the truth of your argument is a reason you lose. The other team is saying the falsity of your argument is a reason you lose, essentially.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, that makes sense. Um, so now I guess we should dive into some of these like framework questions in a little bit more depth with whatever time you have
Hmm.
left. I'm sure we've
Yeah.
already touched on some of these concepts already, but
Hmm.
maybe first you can take me through this policy perspective interpretation of why maybe K's might be unfair.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, in my opinion, the best interpretation is certainly plain focus, which is not like we should weigh the case because it's unfair to move to AF. Instead, it says the only thing that the negative should be able to garner offense off of is the causal consequences of the 1AC. Not only is this the only predictable stasis point from the debate as per the resolution, but anything else opens the floodgates to an infinite amount of critiques. You can say disability, colonialism, anti-blackness, capitalism, Derrida, thousands of others. And all of these critiques can be applied to any rhetoric in the 1AC. So a word that you might notice me use often, and then Mac has also, followed along, is assumption, justification, representation. But there's no bright line for what that actually is, right? Is it a sentence? Is it a word? Does it have to be, a sentence that's this long or this short? Essentially, because it's so vacuous, what the negative is actually saying is that anything in the 1AC is grounds for a link argument. So you have like, these thousands or like literally infinite, I guess, genres of critique, and then they can be applied to one of 10,000 words in your 1AC, which at worst is millions, at best is like way more than that, arguments that the affirmative now needs to prepare for. Because if they don't, the negative gets up and says the word the is rooted in the logic of empire. The affirmative has nothing to say. In a world of framework, they necessarily lose. Because one team has all the time in the world to prep that argument, to prove why it's bad, to cut a bunch of cards for why it's bad. The affirmative will have, not little, but essentially nothing to say. They can't say framework in a world where, we're debating under the negatives interp. So they just automatically lose, which is certainly unfair. So essentially, we have two options in a world of K framework. We can either lose every single debate, which, sounds not very fun, or we can, in preparation, get ready to defend every single word in our entire 1AC from every single perspective they could possibly critique it from. That's not hard to do. That's impossible to do. So we end up losing every single debate, which is obviously bad to be affirmative, right? So that's the first kind of internal link argument for why critiques of representations are bad, or allowing critiques of representations are bad. I think the second argument has to do with ground, and this is more just like about burdens. So the only resolutional burden given to the 1AC is proving that the resolution, the topic itself, is a good idea. The negative creates an arbitrary side constraint that there's this other thing you must first do, or this other burden you must now meet in order to have access to the ballot that is regressive and that is also necessarily unpredictable, which makes it unfair. What is the difference between carving out a self-serving exemption from the resolution and being like, you can win if you prove the res true and defend your reps, versus you can win if you prove the res true and do 20 jumping jacks or 15 push-ups or 30 squats or 15 burpees, right? These are all as predictable, based on like, the burden that we have when the resolution is announced, as each other. So, leads to the same conclusion of why Ks are unfair.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like I'm quite compelled by this regress argument that like there's always some kind of K that they can read. There's the additional problem that we face in theory as well of like when we're being a little bit unreasonable, I think, using like reasonable to mean reasonability,
Mhm.
there's a problem of the distinction between like badness and not being good enough. Like
Oh,
some
yeah, 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 yeah. Well,
like
that's like true.
right, like even if you don't do anything bad, like I'm sure it's possible to find ways that in your 4 minute speech you like didn't say something good enough, or
Hmm, hmm.
you talked about this instead of this, and so you've prioritized this kind of knowledge over this kind of knowledge or something. There's always a way to spin it in some way. However, I do feel like clearly there's logic in the middle, right? Like I feel like we're going to these different extremes. Like it's the same with theory. I should be able to call you out for some fouls, even if I shouldn't be able to call you out for all fouls, because there's an infinite regress of possible ways that I could say that you cheated. And so, just like in theory, I think there has to be some way in K debate to find a middle ground, to be like, clearly in very egregious circumstances, maybe it's worth the harm to predictability, or it's not very unpredictable, to have a K. Like if you say a slur, like obviously that falls into the category of something you should have been able to predict. Like it's not very unfair for us to call you out for that. And maybe we should have a model that incentivizes us to call you out for that. But then on the other extreme, it's like you didn't, you said the United States, that's bad. That seems like very clearly a very unpredictable argument that you shouldn't be held accountable for. But then the problem is like, how do you know what the difference is between these? And
Yeah,
there's like,
I
it's
think
very
that
difficult.
th
Yeah.
there's a pretty easy way to resolve that from the policy side. Whenever we reach this territory of like egregious rhetoric, right, in the vein of slurs or something close, the solution is not giving the negative framework and letting them call us out for it. It's ending the round immediately and having an adult tournament official or even the judge decide on a truthful level whether or not racism actually occurred. Because forcing them to evaluate that question, technically looking at the flow, where dropping arguments is inevitable, where some teams are slower or faster than others, certainly creates a moral hazard. And this is the argument known as like tab solves or judge choice, which we can talk about. But I think that it's kind of like the most persuasive frame of like the policy team can use, which is like, listen, at the end of the day, if truly what we did was this egregious and it impacted safety, it made debate inaccessible, it was, the moral equivalent of literal racism, we should not be debating about this. We should be, like litigating this like we would in the real world, right? This is not a competition anymore. You kind of invoke this D rule that something racist was said, so we should treat it accordingly, right? And everything that doesn't meet that threshold, is certainly unfair to punish us for, because even if you're right in the abstract, you win by the end of the 2-R, that what we said was problematic, right? There's this kind of gateway issue that begs the question, did you win it because we were really problematic? Or did you win it because we had no idea what the fuck to say to the word pick of the word the, or United States being capitalized or uncapitalized, or any, random line in the 1AC, right? So I think it's kind of like, the best of both worlds, because essentially, I don't want to call it a test of faith, because framing it like that is probably pretty bad. But realistically, that's what it is, right? If we reach this egregious level that you have said Ks are necessary for, you should have ended the round. If we didn't reach this egregious level, Ks are not necessary, and they can only, either create unfairness or these kind of false positives where a team, because of their lack of preparation, is falsely branded as racist, not because what they did was seriously problematic. And I think that this narrative is like super important in K debates. Because if you let K debates get away with like the way that they want to articulate framework, you're going to look really bad, right? Because the 2-R is just going to get up and be like, listen, there are more problems to debate than bad plans. people do things in their research, they have assumptions and justifications that are problematic, and we need to be able to critique these things, not just critique the consequences of a hypothetical planned action. The only way to allow this is our interpretation that basically greenlights K's. If they get away with explaining K debate like that, you're fucked because it's super intuitive and it makes sense that you should be held responsible for your performance on top of your plan. Instead, the way you need to push back on that and be like, their model is not like, this utopia where people with good rhetoric get a free pass and people with bad rhetoric are kind of, punished and end up changing because of the existence of Ks. What actually happens is that we never know on a truthful level whether or not rhetoric was actually good or actually bad, because there's such a massive disparity in preparation that a K team can literally win that anything in the entire world, is problematic to say, even if realistically it just isn't. Right. And this is proven by the onslaught of Berkeley prep for an entire year, who I coached. There was never a single 1AC that we debated that said something problematic. All they did was Fiat. Obviously not racist. Gut check. They, read a China impact. Obviously not racist. It's not like their cards were like villainizing China. It just said China tech leadership is on the rise, right? And at a certain level, you have to accept the fact that intuitively, even if individual people aren't, the community is a decent judge on what seriously is and isn't problematic, right? And if you're coming into a round and your immediate instinct isn't to stake it or make it a central question of the debate, the fact that you're opting to go for a K probably shows that you have this intention to technically brute force a link argument, which does not accomplish your stated goal. In fact, it goes against the opposite because it causes things like trivialization. But even worse, it subjects the other team to unfairness, which is bad. And we can get into that later. So that was like a tangent, but it's just so important to control the way that the judge understands the debate. The most important thing that debaters don't realize what they need to is that if your opponent is able to explain your argument to the judge, you have lost, because they will never say that your argument is good. They will always characterize it in a way that is advantageous for them. The only way you can stop that is, one, recharacterize your argument, and two, use the same technique back on them, right? When the judge is sitting and submitting their RFD, they should not be asking themselves what your argument means and looking at the 2NR to find out. The opposite should be true. Their understanding of K-debate should not be like this last bastion of preserving accessibility and stopping racism in debate. They should view it as this, kind of not bad faith, but tricky way of getting people on these technicalities and these small issues, not because those things are necessarily racist, but because the other team just could never in a million years have prepared arguments for why the inverse is true, which makes it trivially easy to kind of prove what you did is bad, right? If I have an hour to find reasons why a word in your app is bad, and you just could never even have imagined that I would get up and do something like this, if I'm competent enough at debate, you're going to lose to me every single time, even especially if I have cards. You're just going to always lose. So that's kind of the point I wanted to stress there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Interestingly, I wonder what would happen if we combined this, so combine this original thought of plan focus because Ks are unpredictable with this carve out for tab solves or judge choice. Plus, maybe we can add another carve out to avoid some of the intuitive responses from the K team. That's if there's anything that falls below the threshold of judge choice, it's not a slur, but it is something that it is educational for us to debate about. For example, for instance, one of our assumptions has racist implications, even if it doesn't rise to the level of a microaggression. That still is something you can say in the round as a reason that the assumption is false, right? Just the same way we do reductio ad absurdum, this the same way we do intuition pumps against arguments. If this were true, this other thing which is clearly false would also be true. So clearly this logic is false. I think that is also something you can allow under this policy model as an interpretation against the K. You could say, listen, there's three types of arguments here and how you should adjudicate them. The first type of argument is a K that picks on a very small, specific kind of rep that is entirely unpredictable. These arguments just don't evaluate at all. They're completely unpredictable. It would be an infinite skew against us. The second kind of K argument is one where they say that we made something that was a terrible, egregious abuse akin to a slur. In that case, go to tab, stop the round. Don't continue tactically adjudicating this. We have 4 minutes to tell you why this is or is not like racist, that's crazy. This is a terrible way to do this. If this actually is something that is causing something like psychic damage to you, we should clearly stop this and actually figure this out. With adults, maybe we should be taken out of the tournament, or we should get like disciplinary action or something. But this is a serious issue. This is like also a serious accusation, probably, that should not be litigated in the span of this like 50-minute debate. And then the third subset is like maybe there's something in between that's like an argument that says that our assumptions are incorrect because they justify other things that are clearly wrong. Or, for example, like utilitarianism is wrong because if you take it to its extreme, it justifies atrocities and stuff. I think that's still an acceptable argument to make as defense, right? Not even just drop the argument, to be clear. I think there's a difference between these two. It's not like you automatically drop our argument because one warrant is wrong. It is just defense on that warrant. It is just defense on the logic that it is critiquing. I think that there's like competitive incentives for you to still talk about that, just like there's competitive incentives to still make defensive claims. And so it still has space in the round. We can still get whatever educational value from it that you want. And then this takes away a substantial portion of the ground that the K team has to respond to this kind of interpretation.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also think that this is just like a built-in feature of the original framework interp. We would not exclude links that indict the logic of our arguments with the conclusion that the argument is wrong. Like you can make defensive arguments for why, racist assumptions entail an incorrect conclusion. That's totally fine. Our argument is just that this defense cannot become offense. You cannot win for saying the 1AC is wrong about this, so now vote negative immediately because we've pointed out one incorrect line out of thousands in the 1AC. So it's basically like, now that I think about it, I actually think it's quite a good argument. And I think that the like real scary way of going about it is that insofar as our model preserves the capacity to let people critique racist assumptions and explain why they are wrong actively, that also resolves all the negatives offense about things like subject formation specifically. Because it's not as if we never let you, critique the research project of the 1AC. We just say that you cannot win for proving that it is incorrect. So essentially what this equates to is that under our model, the AF preserves fairness. In serious, egregious instances of racism, you can just go to tab. If the instances of racism are trivial, then it'd be unfair to punish us because it's very likely that what we did was not actually bad. You would just technically brute force it because of the monopoly on prep you've created for yourself. And all of these arguments in the middle, right? You can just get up and explain why we're wrong. We would lose that argument. Obviously, we would not read arguments that are false in the future, so that's sufficiently deterrent. But more importantly, we'd understand why our research was bad, which would prevent us from internalizing incorrect assumptions, which would, essentially short circuit the internal link to how debate shapes our subjectivity, right? So it is incorrect to say we iterate on false assumptions under our model because those false assumptions are just called out and teams can explain why they're false, which solves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two additional points to talk about here. One, I just thought of it, it might not be true. It's kind of half-baked. Is like, I actually disagree with the thesis that the ballot is the number one thing that shapes incentives. I
Hmm.
think it's actually very much not. Like, if I reflect on my like 8 years competing in debate, I cared about like how people thought of me much more than the wins and losses. And if anything, the reason I cared about wins and losses to some extent was because it shaped how people thought about me. And so I also think like even besides like reputation socially, I think there's also like an internal dialogue you have with yourself, right? Like ontologically, I like want to make sure that I am a good person. And I think that people like genuinely do want to do this by and large. Like I guess every now and then you have someone who like I don't know, really only cares about winning and doesn't care if they're racist in the process and only cares about racism insofar as it affects their winning. But I think a lot of
Hmm.
the time it's not true. A lot of the time, like if you tell someone they're using violent language, they'll be like, oh wow, I didn't know that. And then they will change without like an incentive. Like you don't have to like, okay, for example, in the real world, if someone says something that I think is problematic, I'm not going to be like, okay, now give me $10 or something, like you have to, this lesson has to stick with you. Or like, now I'm going to like punch you in the face. It's for your own good because otherwise you will never actually have a tangible incentive in like, this is kind of ridiculous, I think. I think much more like the more compelling story to me that just seems more true is like, if you do take the time to explain to someone that their reps are wrong, most of the time, I think they will change. Like I think that they will at least get, as close to changing as if they lost a ballot on it. Because at least like they're only thinking about changing and not thinking about like their possible responses in the debate or something. Um, and so I think that combined with all of this, I think also might reduce some of the neg offense here. I guess I'm saying neg offense, the K offense, because it could be either side.
Hmm.
In terms of subjectivity shift, because I think it is possible to shift subjectivity not only competitively, which we still preserve to some extent because they still do get defense, but also like just because they now know about this, like I don't know. Um, and
I think that
yeah.
the intuitive response to that is just like, even if true abstractly, probably doesn't really translate to a competitive activity. And the two specific arguments you would make is like one, like it's empirically disproven. Like if this were true, then every single time that they've hit a K and were, realistically probably explained to why what they did was wrong from the perspective of the K, they should have changed their AF, which they obviously haven't. And two, the reason why is because when your opponent is spreading at you at like 400 words per minute, you're under the shared assumption that everyone wants to win. Your opponent frames the debate through technical concessions as well. You're not going to view it as like a genuine attempt to, explain what you did, why what you did was wrong. You're just going to be like, oh, they're just debating me, right? So you're
Wait,
never going to kind of like internalize it like
I
that.
think this is a double bind with subjectivity shift then. Like if all of what you just said is true, I don't think the ballot is going to shape my subjectivity, even if it shapes my practices.
Well,
Uh,
the ballot's not supposed to like the true argument to this
oh, I see what
is
you're
like pretty
saying.
simple, right? It's just like the way that your subjectivity becomes shifted in a negative direction is by constantly, doing research with these racist assumptions and never being called out of it, about it. It doesn't matter if like you do or don't believe that what you did was wrong. The point is that competitively speaking, you're forced to stop doing what you did, which prevents you from believing it.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Like I thought you were gonna say, which I guess you kind of did say, like the internal link is like what you read, right? Like what you read shapes your subjectivity.
Hmm.
And if we prove that there's a competitive incentive about what you read and that this is like empirically verified, um, then it doesn't seem to matter as much if you were called out in the first place, but rather if the ballot affirmed that call out in some way by actually creating this incentive. But I don't know. I
Yeah,
think there's
I
like
think the
a
good
debate to be had
allegory
here.
is like I think the good allegory is like imagine like you have a Republican and a Democrat debating, right? The Democrat can like try to convince the Republican. Very likely the Republican won't really listen. But what happens is if the Democrat's able to sanction the Republican and stop the Republican from consuming Republican media and investing in Republican news sources and doing all of these things, it would definitely like severely inhibit their transition from a Republican to maybe from someone who's, a right-wing extremist, right? And kind of cutting off the source of the things that form these beliefs in the first place, make them, this is the caveat you can add down the line, much more amenable to change, right? Maybe the reason why people don't believe or like there's this kind of buffer to kind of listening to our arguments is because we're really entrenched in our own beliefs. In fact, this is like what most studies actually say that policy teams read for why debate doesn't shape subjectivity. And your argument is that the only way to reverse that, is functionally a try or die claim, is to stop them from like going on and getting deeper and deeper into this kind of rabbit hole. By competitively, punishing that form of research, and A, that like linearly solves them becoming a worse person, but B, it also gets them in that state of mind where then kind of convincing them becomes possible. But the ballot is uniquely key.
Let's back up one step, I think. Like
Hmm.
out of technical stuff more toward like truth.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
I just like I'm not sure how convinced I am by this analogy. Like I think a lot of people, if they face like sanctions for consuming certain media, they might consume that media more, even if
Well,
there's
the implication is that they cannot do that in debate because they would just keep losing, and then if they're competitively incentivized, they would just like stop.
right,
Like the
but
point is that like insofar as they've continued participation in debate, they cannot read the research that we have, criticized as problematic.
I don't know. Like it seems like the cart is kind of being put before the horse here, where it's like we're not trying to convince them that they're wrong. We're trying to force them to stop saying this, and then they will realize that it was wrong, right?
I mean, like honestly, iterating back on it, I think you can make like two versions of this argument. Um, just to just to go back and kind of like re-engineer it from the K perspective, I would say two things now, right? I would say that the like the so here's just like the original argument that we're answering, right? Uh, apologizing, not apologizing, sorry. Like being nice and explaining why they're wrong solves, right? And the argument you made was that, well, this seems to, contradict the thesis of subject formation. Or like my response, sorry, was that no, like they won't listen. Then you said this contradicts the thesis of subject formation. So I think that the best K answer here is first, this needs to happen alongside the ballot, right? And there's really two warrants here. The first one is just what we've talked about because it's the only way to actually to get them to stop in the future, which is like you can call it a necessary prerequisite. And it's like linearly good the less they consume this research. But the second, you could say that like the judge's sign vis-a-vis the ballot is what's key because the judge kind of like affirming that what we've said is correct through our decision and echoing that in the RFD is kind of necessary to actually get them to change genuinely. And this is kind of like, reverse causal because imagine, we got up and we said like, here's why you're bad. And the judge was just like, whatever. It wasn't that bad. You can win the debate. You don't have to be held responsible for it. Obviously, those teams would never actually like stop and, think that what they did might be problematic, right? But in our case, if every time they did something like this, because again, it's a question of models, if every single time they, read a particular type of research, their opponents just called them out on it, right? And their judge kind of like voted for their opponents and echoed that sentiment, then that actually sends them the signal that something needs to change and that they might be wrong. And that is what promotes subject formation, that is what promotes reflection. And again, you have to evaluate this comparatively, right? Because under the policy team's model, they know that it's kind of a no-cost option in the first place to do whatever research they want. Insofar as the worst thing that could happen is that their argument is just dropped. And they also know that it's impossible for the judge, again, under their model, to ever take their opponent's side and be like, here is why you shouldn't say stuff like this. And even if they do say that in the RFD, it seems super bad faith and not genuine if the ballot is kind of cast into the other direction, right? Like imagine you're having a round and your judge gets up and is like, what you did was unacceptable, super bad. Don't do it again. I voted for you and I gave you high speaks. You're going to be like, ha 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 ha, right? You're just never going to really take that to heart.
I kind of just disagree with this. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm just on the opposite side of the intuitions on these analogies, and so they're not
Mm-hmm.
really ringing true to me. Like as a judge, I think I've said stuff like that. Like I've literally given the ballot to someone and simultaneously, outside of an argument that happened in the round was like, you probably shouldn't be making this argument. Didn't come up in the RFD, so I didn't vote on it. But like in the future, you should probably take.
Yeah, I feel like that's just like so much less conducive to change than an RFD that aligns the ballot with the feedback and kind of makes it a focal point of the debate. I think that the RFD like that proves the point of the K team that like your model is like the biggest barrier to these people actually stopping and explains the status quo. Because with RFDs like that, like what you did was bad, probably don't do it again. But I still voted for you, and it's not about my RFD. Let's talk about these other stuff, right? Like it literally sidelines it, which is kind of like
I
taking.
don't know that that's true. I think you can like make them separate issues. Like I can say like, look, it would be interventionist for me to vote this way because it wasn't an argument that was made in the round or something like that, or it was lost.
Well, that's like a false analogy though, right? Because in our example, your example might make sense because maybe they wouldn't listen if it was intervention, right? But our argument is that like assuming this argument is made, right? Like how should your RFD treat it externally? Like
Right.
assuming the argument is
Yeah.
made, the link argument is introduced, how should the judge kind of as an educator, quote unquote, orient themselves like in terms of evaluating the argument and also making the decision? The K team would say that the most kind of like likely way to create change is to, center the racist thing in a debate, cast the ballot in the opposite direction of the team that did the racist thing, and with those two things combined, kind of like explain, echoing what the link explanation was, why what that team did was wrong. And it is much more likely to create change
Right. That
than
makes
as
sense.
if this was like an aside and whatever. And there's also the second argument, the external one, which is just like it's a necessary prerequisite to actually deter them from reading this type of research in the future. In fact, now that I think about it, the card that we read for subject information says exactly this, right? It's about, neurobiological dynamics and sensory motor patterns, blah, blah, blah. But the implication of the card is that when we have this repetitive way of thinking, we do it over and over again, it literally becomes an ingrained habit that's impossible to break. So our
Right.
point is that in a world where they're not sanctioned, and this is like the language the card explicitly used. It actually, in fact, now that I think about it again, it talks about members of the community sanctioning each other. So I think it's super in line with this explanation. Essentially, in a world where they're not sanctioned and they can just keep doing the same and same research, and even if like there's some degree of hesitancy, if they're still like going down this rabbit hole, the more they do it, it literally becomes a habit, right? And it's just like impossible to ever save them past that, right? So we need this kind of like two-pronged approach, which is A, stopping them from continuing that form of research through competitively disincentivizing them from doing so, and B, having this, quote unquote, community member sanction them and give them explicit disapproval, which our evidence says breaks that habit from forming. So I think that when you have like these two arguments that like, might be intuitive to some, not really intuitive to others, but there's at least some like semblance of logic there. And you tie it with a card that kind of like, really matches the point that's being made. Just from like not a true perspective necessarily, but from a strictly strategic perspective, I think this is probably leaning on the side of the K, like when it's packaged like that. But it definitely like again, this is a super annoying argument to answer, and I had to kind of like backtrack a little bit and step back and think about it, just to kind of like come up with all of this, which again, like I wouldn't have the opportunity to do so in a round. And even if I did, it's just like not as simple as just tildeing in fairness answers or predictable answers. So I definitely think this is something that like framework teams should obviously say, right? Like our
Right,
model
right.
solves subject formation. You can just explain why the racist logic is wrong. The argument goes away, and that prevents us from internalizing that. Your interpretation assumes we just never let people call out racist research, which is completely incorrect. Our argument is just that they should not win for problematizing a single line in our entire 1,000 word 1AC.
And interestingly, I think that that argument can be applied here in a more effective way. Like, okay, here's the interesting argument. Maybe I'm not like innovating. This is something that people already say, but
Mm-hmm.
probably a good argument here is like, if if I'm a debater and I'm posed with the option if I've just lost a K round, right, on my reps, I'm posed with two options for how to proceed. Either one, I can change my reps, or two, I can create better framework answers. I know that most people make this like, argument that's just like, oh, well, people will just double down. People will just
Yeah.
come up with better defenses for the reps and they'll just come up with better framework answers. That's not quite the argument I'm making. My argument is a better comparative warrant for that based on our interpretation that we came up with the policy plan focus stuff, which is that if it is true that their interpretation allows effectively infinite possible links to reps, then it is always a competitively losing battle for me to try to change my reps to get around Ks. Because it's just whack-a-mole, right? Like they will always find another rep that I have. So it's impossible, like it is useless for me to go and change all of these different reps after I lose each round because they'll just find the next one. Which means under their interpretation, I will always be more competitively incentivized by the ballot to double down and or change my framework answers instead of changing my reps, which is their link to subject formation. Does that make sense?
I think the argument makes sense in the abstract, but kind of misunderstands the way that theory would work. So again, like even if you're right in the abstract that it's just competitively infeasible for me to defend reps when there's an infinite amount of critiques of them. The problem is that if we're debating under the negatives model, the affirmative has no choice but to defend their reps and, in fact, iterate them as well as possible. Because if they didn't, they would just like automatically lose since framework is no longer an option.
Wait, I'm
So
I'm
like,
making an argument that compares the two interpretations, to be
no,
clear.
I understand, but like the negatives answer is that like it's essentially our interpretation solves double down because doubling down is never the competitively advantageous option because it guarantees a loss. So even if it's hard to defend against infinite reps links, it's your only option. In fact, it actually supercharges subject formation because you're forced to literally have, like the most like ethical and straightforward representations ever. And I also think there's a reasonability argument that's like, listen, like let's be fucking real. There's, especially in PF, not that many Ks on the wiki. There's not an infinite amount of them. Even if there were an infinite amount of them, like the logic that they use is very similar. And even then, there's just some words that are just like uncritiquable, right? And realistically speaking, it's essentially just like there's like structurally built-in reasonability on behalf of debaters and judges where you don't need to be prepared or you don't need to predict a reps link to the word the or the word is to be able to beat it because the reps link is pretty obviously false, right? Like there's like a lot of reps links to a lot of words that just start at zero and are completely infeasible, which is why A, no K team reads them ever. If it was really that easy, you would literally see a fucking thesaurus in the one and C. There's a reason people don't do that. And the second argument is just like you don't need preparation to answer an argument that is like like logically disputable, right? Like that's just true. And the same is true in policy debates, right? Because in policy debates, I can have like infinite small shitty scenarios that impact turn the one AC's impact, or I can have like infinite small shitty advantage counterplans that you would have never seen coming. That doesn't mean those arguments aren't fair, and your own interpretation wouldn't ban them. And the reason like we're able to have like some pushback against those things is because they fucking suck, right? It's because like even if I don't have a card that doesn't say graphene doesn't explode the fucking planet, I can just be like, one, your author is from Reddit. Two, this argument's incoherent. Three, is case outweighs, right? So that will always be a sufficient kind of answer. And the other argument, okay, I've just thought of this argument. I think this is the best one so far, right? So the best one so far is that our interpretation, assuming you're the K team, specifically is about forms of like racism and other isms. So every link argument that doesn't rise to that level is automatically excluded.
But okay, I think all of these are answers. This is also okay. There's two parts of my argument that I have to win. The
Hmm.
first part is if I am correct that your interpretation allows functionally infinite link arguments on reps, then it actually competitively dissuades me from changing reps, and instead it like flips your ballot solvency.
Sure, it
I
makes me
don't
try to get better at framework.
Right. So that one seems true. The one that's contested here is the one that relies on, which is that there are functionally infinite reps links. That if I shifted away from one, I would inevitably shift into a different one. And that's what you're contesting.
Well, there's two arguments. So that's the first argument, right? The other argument is that our interpretation solves doubling down because even if you're right, like the thing about it like this, right? Let's just like fiat a world of framework where now reps links are win conditions, right? In this fiated world of framework, the affirmative can no longer ever invoke framework again. They have to defend their reps. So under our model, doubling down is not an option because you will always lose. So your only choice is to try to get better reps. And the implication externally is that this actually makes subject formation even better because you're forced to literally find the most ethical reps imaginable, which is, just like good. That's the second argument, besides the contestation of the idea that there are infinite reps links.
I guess, okay, so that's interesting. I guess what I meant by double down, maybe we're on the same page here, is that they would defend their reps and that this would be bad. Like
Well,
for
okay, I think
example,
that's a different argument, right? So the problem there is that, well, first, it's just like incongruent. So I don't know how you can jump from there's an infinite amount of reps links to we just defend our reps because the premise seems to have the opposite conclusion. Um,
I
the
can explain
second,
that real quick if you want.
well, yeah, can you? Because I feel like
Sure,
the
yeah.
argument was like the original argument was like because there are infinite reps links, we're not going to try to defend our reps since they will always have another link, which forces us
Yeah.
to flock to something like framework.
So I guess the nuance is what I was originally saying is because they're infinite reps links, we will never try to change our reps because there will always be other reps links. So it's impossible to remove all of the reps that you could link to.
Oh,
Instead,
okay. Well, I think this argument is like easier to answer, right? So the first answer to that is like it's good because if you know a year's worth of debate, you actually manage to defend your representations across like an onslaught of critique, then that's probably a reason that those Ks were wrong. But the very practice of being able to defend your representations and think critically about your research and assumptions is what we have said is good. And also, there are other instances where you just refuse to ever change your reps and then you just keep getting dicked down because you probably say something wrong, which inevitably forces you to switch. And the second argument, which is kind of a corollary, is like there's this implicit strategic calculus where it's like I lose to what seems to be a pretty good link argument, right? Like my evidence calls China like evil, warmongering, or like Oriental people, and I hit a K team killed. I had another team K team killed again. The third team killed again. I just can't defend my reps, right? I'm not gonna like people aren't idiots. They're not gonna keep being like, well, I'll just get better at defending this. They're gonna be like, fuck, this is a false argument out of the one AC, right? And this is seen all the time, right? Like empirically speaking, Michigan debated CSU at the Dartmouth round robin. Their card, said something like referred to black people not in an amazing way. Lost on it. Then they actually tried doing what you said they should do in the finals of the round robin. They read the same card again, lost on it twice. So what did they do? They didn't, run it back for round three. They just took the card out. So TLDR, if this is the argument, then one, the fact that we forced you to defend your representations is necessarily good, and two, people will realize upon iteration and upon a season's worth of debates that some reps are just undefensible, which is probably a really good sign. They should not be defended in the first place, and that is actually what changes your mind the most of all, right? That is what changes your mind the most of all. If you lose the same freaking K link over and over again to the same card, you're going to be like, wait, something is up here, right? There's a problem, and you're going to change it. So
Right.
I would say those are the two responses.
So, okay, I think that is sufficient to handle my argument that I
Mhm.
call double down, which is, I guess, different from your double down.
No,
Um,
it's like the same logic, but like I think the implication is good.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, but I think then there's two options for this team to do if they feel like removing the rep is not an option. Um,
Mhm.
which is like, for example, let's pretend Michigan removes that link. I'm sure they went on to hit another K. That's probably what happened. Maybe the next tournament they ran the same case without that card. They hit a different K. Maybe they won against it for some other reason. But I would bet like after this happens like 5 times and you run the same case, you keep taking out pieces and you keep hitting Ks. You scratch your head and you're like, maybe I need to pivot my strategy. Maybe I should update my framework blocks instead. Maybe I should improve my arguments
Well,
against.
the response to that is that you can't do that in a world of like our model, right? Because now like insofar as like we've quote unquote fiated the world of K debate, framework is no longer a recourse that can be read.
So that's interesting. This creates a really weird dynamic in the round, I think. Because the argument that I would make is if I lose to your interpretation, I'll just answer it more later. You say that's impossible
Well,
under.
this is just like the other more intuitive argument to this is just like choosing not to solves all your offense. Like your argument is that if I get called out for racism, then I will just get better at like explaining why racism doesn't matter. That sounds like a problem with you, not our interpretation, especially when you literally have the option to just defend your representations. No one's holding a gun to your head and forcing you, to go and quote unquote double down. But the second argument is that like, you are one among not that many, right? We've given empirical examples of how teams have changed out individual cards. You have this advent of things like soft left apps and apps, quote unquote, against the K that the top policy teams, both in college and high school, have continually opted for. So essentially, what you're telling us is that, oh, with competitive incentives in mind, I'm going to go against the grain of what, like, the best teams in the nation have been doing and just go and get better at explaining why racism is no big deal, right? That sounds like, that's a you thing, not a K framework thing. Externally, though, I think that, again, insofar as our implication is you should lose for bad representations, there's like this kind of critical point that's like, even if you double down once or twice, our argument is that you would never win for having racist representation. So inevitably, you reach a point where, like, obviously this isn't working. I have to go and I have to defend my representations, which is like, I guess, like the other way of articulating the reason why our interp solves, right? Like, we have made a paradigmatic argument that teams should never win for racism, right? So even if they're right that losing 1 to 2 to 3 rounds might not dissuade them from changing their rhetoric and might, lead them to do X or Y or Z, our point is that there comes a time, maybe it's your first tournament, maybe it's your second, where you realize, shit, I need to change my reps, which is why our model solves. The comparison is that under your model, this incentive is never created in the first place. It's never created in the first place. And I would also go as far as to argue that if this argument is introduced in conjunction with the drop the argument claim, we would be like, okay, well, if you have people like you who, even with the threat of the ballot, would try to double down, then we should take the most extreme measures imaginable. We shouldn't even think about letting you get away with just the argument being dropped, because we've said if we punish you 5 times in a row, you would still consider reading racist representations. So we're not going to drop your argument 15 times. We're just going to keep voting you down until you finally switch. So it's basically just like if you want us to presume that you are in bad faith, you should be treated like you're in a bad faith,
So I
right?
guess
And you should be given.
right. The
Oh,
new
sorry, yeah, yeah.
like it's still a conditional claim. It's like if you are right that I am only driven by competitive incentives, and if I am right that there are infinite possible links that you will
Well,
spin as racist, then I will not have a competitive incentive to shift.
wait,
Um,
I think that the conditional articulation of that is probably like picked apart in cross X. I mean, I would just ask you like, okay, are you going to double down? Yes or no? If you say yes, it's not conditional.
what I'm saying is that if this model is true, like
Okay,
it,
our model is true. We have infinite amount of reps links. Will you double down? Yes or no?
If I'm forced to double down, like
Who's for like your coach is gonna like put a
yes,
bag over your head and like
no,
pour water on it until you go and update framework?
I'm not only motivated by competitive incentives, right? The answer to this is what we talked about way back. Like, I'm a person. I'm motivated mostly by reputational incentives and like ontological. I probably will take
So
this.
wait, but that's such a contradiction, right? Because you're like, I'm motivated by reputational incentives. So what I'm gonna do is that after I lose to, incessant critiques of me being racist, I'll just get better at explaining why racism doesn't matter.
That's what I'm
Doesn't
saying.
seem like
This is conditional on you disproving that I'm motivated in that way. This is conditional on you winning the competitive incentives for the end all be all.
well, I feel like we don't need to do that. Like I feel like the conditional doesn't work when you're making a claim about yourself, right? So
It's
we would just ask you like, are you are you motivated?
like,
Wait,
okay,
sorry.
so my original argument is that I will change this with or without losing. You say, no, you won't. So I say, if I am this evil person who won't change this
Okay,
without,
I see.
then I
Um,
double down.
Yeah, I mean, I think the better argument we should make is that like this is not a question of individual people, but rather like structurally how the community is oriented. In fact, like you would probably have made the arguments for us that debaters primarily are driven by competition and strategy, right? This is the
Like
thesis of
that's
fairness.
my point is I'm not making those arguments. In this framework debate,
Like
I'm
these arguments are never made.
no, what I'm saying is that debaters are motivated primarily by
Oh
reputation.
what's your offense? If you're not going to say that competition is like a common denominator.
Competition also matters. Like, it is a common denominator, but it's not the end all be all in terms of how people shift subjectivities. This is purely about subjectivity shift.
Well, I mean, my point is that on the fairness debate, you'd kind of have to make a claim to explain why fairness isn't impacted that ways. That kind of insinuates debaters are primarily driven by competition. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to
I don't
explain why we should maximize fairness.
that. I can say that competition is like I can say that fairness is the most important thing in a competition, while
Hmm.
simultaneously holding that the way that we will change outside of the competition due to the competition is not purely motivated by fairness. Like, I can say that within the competition, fairness is a constitutive element that matters, and that also the effects of the competition outside of it are not purely motivated by fairness because people are human.
I mean,
Like,
I
that's
think,
definitely not a contradiction. Like, this
well,
is
I mean,
true about.
I think it's a false equivalence, right? Because when we're talking about the way that we change our advocacies, that's like purely within the realm of the competition. So you might be right that in the real world, right, outside of debate, people are nice and they're ethical and blah blah blah. But our argument is that uniquely in this space, if you are right that everyone is primarily driven by competition, which is why fairness outweighs, then
But
even if some people prioritize reputational incentives, then like aggregately, it would still be good to kind of like have these punitive mechanisms in play. I
I
also think that, like, I mean, look, the simplest way of going about this argument is just like gut check, right? Like gut check all the stuff we were talking about earlier. What do you think is more conducive to making people change their minds, right? Is it, a competitive signal that what you did is not okay, which, means a lot to you as someone who is, at the very least, understood and recognized that debate is a competition, and also simultaneously, to the judge of this competition aligning with your opponents making the racism a focal point in the RFD? Again, all the stuff we talked about earlier. Or is it, your model, which is just like, we forget about the argument that was made. It's an aside in the round, and, we move on with our lives, right? Like, even if you're right that people are reputationally driven, they're not saints. And even if you're right that they're reputationally driven, they're also competitively driven to some extent. So the way we maximize, the likelihood that their subjectivities form in the right direction is through our model, not yours. Like, even if you're like, I guess like, if everyone who was debating, believed that Gullible was written on the ceiling, and was the offspring of Mother Teresa or whoever else was like a saint, and whatever their opponent said, they would instantly believe and change their behavior because of it, then you would be right, right? But there's like this fundamental like, like debaters aren't like that, right? Like there needs to be a one size fits all solution necessarily. Um, and the best one I think is like the drop the debater model.
right. I think this is a much better argument, this comparative argument. I think that, like, when I'm saying fairness outweighs, that does not imply that people are primarily driven by competitive incentives. Because there's a difference in terms of like what matters in the debate and what people are driven by in general as
Yeah,
humans.
I think I agree
Yeah, but I
abstractly.
do think this comparative stuff that's like maybe people are driven by both. Like, yes, maybe like 70% of the time they'll change anyway without the ballot. but 30% of the time they won't, and they only will do so if we drop them. And so that's still net offense for our
Yeah,
framework.
drop the debater is additive, not exclusive, I think,
Right.
right? So dropping the debater will convince everyone who would also be convinced by dropping the argument, but dropping the argument would not convince everyone who would only be convinced by dropping the debater. Does that make sense? It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah.
I think the only ways that I can answer that then are either one, if I find a reason why dropping the debater actually backfires, that
Which is
like
like double down,
I
but
guess it
that
could be
gets
double
into
down.
the.
I don't know that it is. Like,
I don't think so. Yeah.
I don't know. Like, I am kind of intuitively persuaded by arguments that are like you can't materially change people, or like you can't like use material incentives to change people's opinions because then they will like
I mean,
they
we've like the response to this is like we've read psychological studies that say you can't.
right, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Um, so that would have to be debated out, and then somehow I would have to like either account for your psychological studies or something. Then the only other option I have is I could use this as defense and say that maybe you're right, maybe your framework like very marginally increases the odds that someone shifts their subjectivity. But I have this framework that does almost the same thing um, in terms of the benefit of shaping subjectivity. And then I use evaluative modesty to say that like yours is like infinitely abusive and like completely breaks debate in all of these other ways because of predictability and stuff without having to say fairness first, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that does make sense, but I think that like the degree to which drop the debater solves comparatively better to drop the argument is probably large enough for the extra amount of offense the K team has to outweigh.
Does it? Is it large enough under our?
I think like intuitively, especially if there's a card that substantiates it, it's pretty large.
I don't know.
Especially because like the intuition here, right? It's the same as we've kind of talked about. Like drop the argument versus a critique of racism just doesn't seem like super like it's not the argument you start off believing. So I think like if the K team can like spin the right narrative and be like, listen, like we've read studies that prove this is the best way to change minds, and this is like the framing that you can make. Like you cannot risk being wrong. Like here's why you have to earn negative. Because if you risk being wrong and you're incorrect and you choose to drop the argument instead of the debater, then if you are wrong, the habits are already formed and it's too late to change your mind then, which is the argument about like the remember when I was talking about like sanctioning being a quote unquote prerequisite to stopping like bad habit formation. Like they need to stop reading the research that's making them this type of person. So like the way that you can kind of like package everything all together, just be like, if they are incorrect about drop the argument, there's no going back. It's irreversible. You need to start off on the right foot.
I don't know. Like I'm not very persuaded by this argument. It really does seem like a slippery slope. Like the argument I'm making is that we fulfill most of the change in incentives without any competitive change, which is just the like people care
Well,
about
yeah. The
their.
the the response the response to that is like one, you don't fulfill most of the change because here is why losing uniquely is key. That's all the stuff about the RFD. You can say this from intuition. You could also like use a card. And then I have a framing argument. That's like if you think this debate is hard to resolve, here is a perfect tiebreaker. The risk that we are right outweighs the risk that they are right. Or like, yeah.
That's what I'm
So
responding.
like, oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So whatever you say against like each of these incentives, you're not going to be able to push them to zero. I think I will be able to win in most rounds that for most people or many people, they will change if they're convinced just because they care about reputation or because they literally care about being a good person. For the other like 50% maybe, I think it's more like 20% maybe. There still are competitive incentives, which is the drop the argument stuff. That's still competitive, right? You will lose the argument. You won't be able to go for it. And so you won't be reading it again if this happens over and over again because it doesn't help you at all. For the like the sliver of those who are not motivated by reputation, not motivated by being a good person, not motivated by the competitive incentives of drop the argument, only motivated by drop the debater, your logic applies, which is that the only tiebreaker is like being risk averse and being like, well, we don't really know if they'll be completely motivated by this punishment, so we have to increase the punishment. But I feel like that logic applies to a slippery slope to like any crime, right? Like we don't know if they'll be dissuaded by a year in prison, so you have to put them 2 years in prison. Or else there might be a risk, there might be a higher risk comparatively. There probably is a comparatively higher risk that they would go out and like be more likely to go commit this crime again. It's the same for every degree of change in punishment.
I feel like there's some assumptions being made that I don't necessarily agree with. So I think that there's this like foregone conclusion that it's true the majority of the debate community is constituted by people who, absent a competitive incentive, would change. That I just like personally disagree with. And I think the other thing is like there's not like these three classes, right? Um, insofar as like we do not know the population breakdowns, right? For all we know, everyone can be, a great person. Everyone can be a horrible person. There can be a mix of both, right? And our argument is that the decision that maximizes the chance that the greatest amount of people will stop being racist in the future is one where you evaluate the debate through drop the debater, right? And our argument is that because it is impossible to go and do a census bureau on the debate community and gauge how ethical they are, right? You basically have like a trust me, bro, people are ethical. And then you have trust me, bro, people aren't ethical, right? There's only two ways to break the tie. One is logic. What do you think on aggregate is the best way to change people's minds? Obviously, it's aligning your RFD. Even if they were good people abstractly, you have not like it's like this threshold argument. Like it's like being a good person does not mean that if a judge says, "Oh, what you did wasn't cool, but I'm not going to talk about it because it's not about the round," it's sufficient to change your mind. So actually, even those good people might not be able to, might not change their minds in a world of drop the argument, compared to, in a world of drop the debater. So that's like the first thing. Just like in terms of this logic argument, aggregately speaking, it is the most conducive to change that we drop the argument or drop the debater. Sorry. And the second argument is like a risk framing issue. That's like if you are unsure, you should assume equal odds that there's an equal chance that we're right and equal chance that they're right, right? But you should weight our arguments higher because the impact of us being wrong is so much larger than the impact of them being wrong. Because if they're wrong, it's literally irreversible, and now there's nothing we can do. But if they're wrong, at worst, we can just like revert back to this drop the argument model and still preserve the risk of people changing. And this is not to mention like the stuff we talked about earlier about why drop the argument is good on the debater side because it specifically disincentivizes debaters from allocating a lot of time to critiquing the racist argument. It kind of shows affirmative teams that they can kind of cast racism away as an aside. And comparatively, drop the debater is much better because it makes it the focal point of the round inside of the debate before the decision is cast. There's like all of these other reasons uniquely why drop the debater is good, and all of that is kind of being compared to this drop the argument like claim with the warrant being like some people are good and they would maybe change. And I think that there's like a lot of nuances and backdrop that this doesn't really take into account.
Okay, I have a few things to say about what you said, and then I
Yeah, sorry, that was like a
have
tangent.
distilled this into like a central question that we have to
Mhm.
answer. So random things. I don't think people have to be good people. I think they just have to be reputationally motivated, even if they're like terribly selfish. I think 100% of the debate community is motivated by social reputation, because wins and losses don't matter outside of social reputation. Maybe they matter to like I don't know, like getting into college or something. But honestly, at the top, I think the vast majority of debaters are much more motivated by being cloudy, and having a reputation for being a good debater among their peers compared to like the very marginal changes of like college admissions. But I don't know, maybe again, maybe
Wait,
around some
sorry, to clarify, I feel like another argument I've just thought of like if reputational motivation is true, I feel like wins and losses are the most reputational
right,
of
that's an
all.
argument you can make too. But I
Yeah, yeah,
guess
yeah.
like I disagree with that in the context of racism. Like my intuition is that if like someone is called out for being racist, and that would probably affect their reputation a whole lot more than like if they like won like got to quarters instead of octos or something. But the second little thing I was gonna say, maybe I'm not remembering it. The core question though on all of this, I think, is if there are degrees to links on the K, um, like what to do with different levels of abuse. Because a lot of this seems true of like very clear, like you were egregiously racist stories, or like this clearly, is racist. But I like, what does your framework
Well,
do?
the logical argument is that, like, over time, if you're critiqued for the same rep and you always lose, it's probably bad. And over time, if you're critiqued for the same rep and you always beat it, it's probably not a good rep, right?
How
Like,
does
our
that?
argument isn't that, like, you lose upon an accusation of racism being made. You obviously have the chance to defend your research or defend your representations. And for the mass majority of critiques, it's kind of obvious why they aren't racist in the first place. There's
But
millions of arguments you can make. You can
this
make intuitive. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
this requires a line of reasonability because if it doesn't have a line of reasonability, then the offense defense paradigm of this higher categorical layer without plan focus implies that if there's any
No,
risk,
I disagree. I don't think that, like, I think that the K team would say that racism is binary, right? Like, you're racist or you aren't. There's no such thing as a risk of
that's
racism.
just like that seems completely false. Also,
Wait,
like, wait, like I think that that's just incorrect because I think everyone in like the society that we live in is racist, like has subconscious racist thoughts.
no, but here's the difference, right? There's a difference between scope and there's a difference between like risk, right? So the K team doesn't say any risk of racism, right? Outweighs, right? The risk of racism is either 0 or 100, right? Either you're racist or you're not. But the severity to which you are racist can obviously differ, and this would be the scope of racism. So essentially, what I'm trying to say here is that it does not require a degree of reasonability. Our argument is just that if your research is racist, you should lose. You reserve the right to win that your research was not racist. And versus the majority of links that you're so fearful of, this is the easiest thing ever to do. If it was the case that people could not beat links out of random words, I promise you, I would have came up with one in C's already that literally looked like dictionary.com straight down. Here's why like every word you use was racist. That's the first problem. The second problem, intuitively speaking, is that like all of these random words, insofar as they're so common and so prevalent throughout the 1EC, means it's very likely they're also in the 1NC. So just like from a logical perspective, you can't read a K of the word the if your 1NC says the word the. You can't
Right.
read a K of the word and.
I don't
Yeah,
think that's relevant to my point. My
no,
point
the point I'm trying to make is that like the super trivial random link arguments like really don't exist.
that
And if
just
they did exist, it's super easy to beat
that
them.
seems empirically false to me. I judged a link that said you must not use the words United States at the LD tournament, and it won. Um, like,
Well, it should lose instantly because they just used the words United States when they explained what the link was. And
well,
their evidence definitely says United States as well.
obviously the argument is that like only saying United States is bad, or like the argument is not that saying the words United States is wrong. The argument is that calling the land of the United States is wrong.
Yeah, that
Uh,
sounds racist.
like,
That's not a trivial link. That's super bad.
I feel like that's such a trivial link.
No,
Really?
it's so bad. You can't do that.
Ideas of what a trivial link is then. Is
No, I mean like that's like super bad. No, I'm kidding, obviously. But like the other team, well, there's two arguments, right? One, forcing the other team to defend their research is good in the first place,
they
right?
can't,
You should not.
it is probably true that it is more bad than not to use United States. Like there are two options, right? This is the problem technically structurally within the debate. The team defending the rep, their only option is to say that it is zero racism. The team attacking the rep can say that it is a little bit racism.
No, I disagree. I disagree. I don't think that like the K team. Here's the actual problem. If the K team ever makes this argument that like there's a risk it's racist, their interp is not unfair. It is infinitely abusive because of the argument that you're talking about. Because offense is one-sided insofar as the affirmative can never win for being not racist or anti-racist. That is never a win condition under framework. But they can always lose if there's any chance that they were racist, which is this offense defense structure. So if the K team makes an argument about risk, like any risk you're racist, then what you're saying makes sense. Then it's literally impossible to ever beat the K because if there's like a like infinitesimally small risk you were racist, you automatically lose because you cannot generate offense. So that is not the way that I think that K should be articulated. You should never make this argument for the reasons like I just
I
gave.
think this
Instead,
it's a very big problem because I don't think anything is certain. I think everything is credence levels. Like I don't think that it is possible to say for certain that anything the AF did was racist or not. I think
it doesn't have
every
to be certain. It just has to be like yes, no.
that's what certainty is, right? Like if
Like
it's 90%
I don't.
yes, 10% no, like what do you do?
Okay, maybe like the solution is that you have to be more certain it is racist than it isn't. So like 51%. But the point is that it's not like 1% risk outweighs. Like I feel like this is a very intuitive like calculation we could make. Like even if we're not like this is 100% racist, obviously it's like okay, it's probably a bad standard to be like you can only punish racism if you're 100% sure of it. I think the better standard and like realistically what the K team would have to kind of stick them to is like it's like more true than false, right? You have to prove that there's a higher likelihood it's racist than it isn't. And with some link arguments, like there's not a 51% chance that using the words United States is racist. It's definitely below that 50% threshold, which is
Yeah.
sufficient to like exclude that link argument, which means you don't win on these silly links. So that's
Right.
actually I think the best threshold to kind of set.
Although
Like that's non-arbitrary.
very difficult technical debate to do because like what arguments do you even make to say that it's not racist? Like I feel like the
There's
argument
no
is
link, there's
argument.
no warrant.
Well, right, but that all of those are non-arguments. Like the argument is not, there's no reason it's not racist. There's just
Well,
a,
no, that's not how debate works. The burden of proof is on the team presenting the argument. So like
yeah,
if the okay, so like if I like prove that you haven't proved your argument, then your argument is false. Like if you do not like what like I promise you like if we go into the logic of why the United States is racist, it's just completely zero. Like that's not a coherent warrant for it. Um, and the other thing is, I promise you that given the popularity of the words United States, that definitely appears somewhere inside of their 1 and C2 in like the wrong context.
I mean,
The other argument is just like calling the United States does not mean like we don't recognize indigenous people. It's a legal term of art. That probably zeroes the link. It's a legal term of art, right? When we say United States, we're not referring to like, the owner of the territory we inhabit. We're referring to a legal entity, that passes policies, right? Which obviously is not like the floor. The floor is not passing policies. The United States is, right? There's like millions of arguments you can make. I think that one alone brings the link down to zero because
I
it's
guess
just
so.
descriptively false
I'll
that we
use
have like it's
example of
sorry.
round that I judged. One, the resolution
Uh-huh.
said in the United States, and so the plan text said in the United States, meaning the land of the United States, and that's how they defined it. Secondly, like the team was very careful not to put United States, referring to the land of the United States in their own K, or anywhere in the 1 and C or anywhere in the round. I don't know how you say like, well, I don't think it's racist. Um, like I don't, like you haven't proven that it's racist. Oh, you read a card? Well, I disagree with that card. The card isn't worth.
Well, I mean, like I'll say two things, right? I mean, like the first thing is that obviously what's it called? You could still like make the legal term of art argument like in the United States refers to like a very specific territory that's like, what the literature uses to refer to these things. We do not endorse that. We do not say the United States is this or made a prescriptive claim. We just described it, right? So it's it's like, let's say we're passing a legal policy on an indigenous reservation, right? And there's like a particular name that that reservation has, right? I don't, and I use that name because it's what the legal literature uses, right? That doesn't mean that I support that and I think that name should be what the reservation has, assuming the name is Western. It just means that like, I'm referring to like a very specific technical term as an analogy, right? And at the end of the day, like, listen, like, if we have this back and forth and we cannot think of a single argument that beats this link argument, like, defense just does not exist, right? There's nothing we can say or do at the level of like deep, like defending our rhetoric for why it is good or like for why it is not even like our threshold. Our job right now is not even to prove it's good, right? That's not even the threshold that we have set. We are trying to prove why it's not bad, right? Why there is no link. If we cannot prove that there's no link, no matter what we do or what we think of, that's probably a reason you shouldn't be using that research. Like if you literally cannot defend it, like you can't even get the risk of the link below 50%, then like it's probably bad. Like it just makes sense intuitively, especially if this debate happens over and over again over a long, long period of time. Like it may seem silly, like, oh, like off my gut, this is not racist. But if you can't actually warrant that, then we're probably wrong. I think we're like me and you, we're just, we're just racist. And we have to recognize that we just can't call the land of the United States the United States. It's just unacceptable. And we've tried to make it acceptable. We've just failed. Like it's kind of a hard pill to swallow, but I feel like that's like the true K response.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. I still think so. I guess okay. The conclusion of this is the way that the K team gets around the infinite abuse story from the framework is by saying you just need to win that there's a lower than 50% chance of a link, right? And that
Exactly, which excludes like half of like the billions of links. And then the other thing is that like, I think it's a true double blind, right? Like over time, if you are unable to beat back a specific link or set of link arguments, you are probably in the wrong. And if you can, then who cares if people can read them? Like this is like saying that like if someone says like the sky is blue, so you're racist, right? That's not like a reason you automatically lose the debate because you can just get up and be like non sequitur and move on, right? And like and applying this like same standard to like all the links that the policy team is like so scared of, we realistically get down to a very few set of links, right? And this is kind of empirically reflected in the link arguments that people do read. Everyone reads the same freaking links. It's the IR link. It's the Fiat link. Ooh, it's all of like these like very kind of contextual topic specific link arguments that we see over and over again year over year, right? There's a reason why, if anything has not changed in the past decade of K debate, it's the style of link arguments, right? You're critiquing a very particular logic, you're critiquing a very particular assumption of representation. Maybe it's threat discourse, maybe it's the way you understand the environment as separate from human nature. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. It's certainly not an infinite or uncountable amount. In fact, it's probably countable on two hands. And that's just kind of like it's basically like a functional limits argument, if you will. Like links are functionally eliminated, like practically and realistically, even if not theoretically.
Yeah. I think okay, that makes sense. I guess the place my mind goes to is just like spams of links, which is probably the same idea as frivolous theory. So then the response to that would maybe be like I am warming up to this idea of like RVIs on links that are not true. Um,
Yeah.
I think that's the only way, like, I don't know. There's two possible, like, the only possible response I can think of to like, oh, well, you put 10 links on my argument and I just didn't get to all of them or something. Like the only possible response is like skill issue. But then like I feel like with these kinds of links, maybe that does create abuse where like it might not be technical because that means that the K team has 11 ways to win.
Mhm.
And you have to get all 11 of them below 50% to win.
Well, I don't think that's too hard because if you're making 11 link arguments, they're also probably not good and you probably don't have a lot of time. It's like the same like the same logic this is like the condo bad argument, right? It's like, oh, you have like five counter plans. There's nothing I can do, right? Like just answer them. They're probably not good counter plans because there's so many of them. I think something that's interesting kind of thinking about is like maybe there's this caveat that's like if a K team introduces like it's basically like conditional K is bad. Like if a K team introduces a K, the round must enter on that. Like you cannot like revert to something else after having accused us of racism once or twice or 11 times, let alone. Maybe there's some kind of argumentative merit there. But I think that like, like debate is equal in the sense that both teams have the same amount of time to answer arguments. And if spam 10 off 1 and C's have ever told you, realistically, there's not many like dude, like realistically speaking, there's not 11 racist things that the 1 and C could have possibly done. So like you can say 100 link arguments. And if I get up and I'm like reject every link argument without a warrant because it's their burden of proof, probably 80 of them disappear. And if you say this is stupid, the next 15 go. Like it's really like quantity does not matter in the face of quality.
Yeah. I wonder, it would be interesting to make like some sort of argument at the top of this kind of debate against Blippy K links. That's just like a
Mhm.
list of like, here are five burdens that each one has to achieve.
Yeah, it's like burden of proof. We get answers against new recharacterization. You should hold the line and give us the opportunity to defend ourselves if an argument is technically mishandled, because anything else risks trivializing racism, which outweighs, if they are right, outweighs like the unfairness allowing us to like make a new argument.
So we were just talking about these like buckets of answers that you can apply generally to all sorts of links. Um, and I think we mentioned like they must have warrants, they must have, they must be properly explained, etc. We get new answers to recontextualization. You were saying that there might be one where you like if we mishandle one, we get new answers.
Yeah. So it's like if we mishandle a link argument, we should be able to answer it new. Otherwise, it risks falsely, concluding we were racist. That's trivializing. The only reason why a new argument would be bad is because it's unfair. If they're right about the K, that shouldn't matter in the face of like, potentially resolving a false accusation of racism.
Right. Okay, that's smart. So that's
Yeah.
like okay. I feel like I am pretty persuaded by this. Like if we
Yeah.
because we were confused about it. Like you should give us a break
Yeah.
when it comes down to questions of like whether or not something is racist. That shouldn't affect your credence. But yeah, this hijacks kind of the fairness outweighs argument that the other side's going to make.
Hmm.
But we can also answer fairness outweighs in a lot of different ways. So that's what we'll actually end up talking about in the next video or in depth. Um, but yeah, I think that we've talked a lot about subject formation and some of these different issues about how we can stack up like the core framework arguments on the policy and case sides against each other. So I hope we've given you some food for thought. I know that I have a lot of things to think about now. So it's been great talking with you, Aidan.
Yeah, of course.
So just before we leave off, we will add another like brain teaser thought experiment in the description of this YouTube video as well, where we will have you, answer some more different kinds of interesting arguments on the other side, maybe like RVIs on links that have defense on them, for instance, and see if you can really test some of these more nuanced framework arguments against the K. So if you want to continue submitting responses there, we will do the same thing we did today. We'll talk about those at the top of the next video.
That's
Uh,
like free coaching.
yeah, exactly. So definitely don't pass up on this opportunity. But yeah, if anyone has any other questions, we'll talk about them if you put them in the YouTube like comment section, and we will continue our lessons on the paradigm issues and questions of Ks next time. See ya.
Bye.